Hello there. So I want to continue today by building upon the initial entry to this series where we were looking at the fertility idols like the Venus, and I want to start expanding into new territory now where we'll be looking at some of the symbolic forms governing life through consumption and animal matter. And I think that the sequence of moving from symbols of life concerning birth to symbols of life concerning consumption is a logical one, because after the primary experience of being thrust into the world, then there is the responsibility of living in our organism and meeting the needs of that organism. And obviously we need to eat to live, we need to consume the bodies of animal and vegetable matter to sustain our bodies, lest we perish or be consumed by the body of another who possesses the same vital requirements as we do. So consumption obviously has a somewhat tragic element to it for the one being consumed, and maybe that's something that we should explore more in a future video in the death series perhaps. But for now, I think that we should stay more focused on the vitalizing and the generative aspects of these acts. So humans are organisms with the same primal needs as every other living creature. But what makes us so different is our capacity for introspection and complex mentation, and the ability to extrapolate from that mentation codifications of manipulated matter that symbolically communicate back to those primal interests, and we call that art in the modern tongue. And today I want to look at two contrasting examples that both share familiar patterns in the motifs but go about expressing them somewhat differently. And I want to see if these things can actually say anything to us about the primacy of our vital organism. So I want to differentiate between two branches of primitive expression. One centered in the cave art systems with its masculine and animal forms, and the other in a more female-centric representation accompanied by also some very interesting animal inclusions in that as well. And it's the second one that I'll explain at the end, which is going to be the real highlight of this video. But to set that up, we're going to have to address this matter of the man caves. And so let's now begin with the depictions of the caves and what they can say about systems of life. The cave depictions that I'm drawing from today center around human and animal forms, often juxtaposed near to each other, and in very special cases they are hybridized into each other to make a completely new creature. So let's consider the animal forms first, okay? Considering the hundreds of potential animal species that primitive man must have been exposed to, it's quite telling how the same type of animals show up on the cave walls, isn't it? It's almost like there's a reason for it. And I believe that there certainly was a reason for it, because these animals were of particular importance to the mind of primitive peoples, simply because they shared an umbilical link of life to these creatures. Their patterns of life were tied directly into the patterns of life of these animals. They might not have only looked interesting to these people, looked novel in some kind of way, but they also would have provided consumptive resources and skins for protection from the elements, would have made these animals special cases for isolation and indeed depiction. That's why We don't see so many cave depictions of things like beetles and worms, for example, because these animals are simply not significant enough to inform our patterns of life in any kind of significant way. And so the brain doesn't select them for isolation and expand their form into a symbolic representation. Symbols have to be special. They have to possess elements that are in some way significant to the human organism that created them. And this goes for primitive cave paintings as it does for modern artists making images in the 21st century. Today, our brain renders the significant and leaves out the insignificant. The brain is always on this active hunt for essentials, and out of those essentials it creates these blueprints for its symbols. So then, these animals were important because their life force became our life force, and they helped us to fulfill the prerequisites of our organism, and so they became symbols of life. We also notice that masculine figures often accompany these animals, and this is also very significant to understand. Why are there only men depicted in these cave representations? Well, when we address the underlying context, I think it becomes fairly obvious. The prerequisites of life maintenance through patterns of consumption were facilitated not only by the animals, of course, but by the men who hunted them. Hunting would have been the primary measure of requiring consumptive resources. It would have been your job, as I said in the first Symbols of Life video, and therefore the humanoid figures are addressed in a masculine form, meaning that men would have occupied the primary positions, not only in resource acquisition, but also in the religious life of the community. And if this is the case, we could also see these men as occupying the role of the image makers, since I believe that the image makers were also connected to the religious life of these people. They were symbolically important, and these images weren't simply there for decoration. They actually signified something that was vital to these people. They were symbols of life. They weren't simply pretty pictures. So the male is playing quite a large role in this picture that we're painting here. And this is complemented when we get into these strange hybridizations of human and animal together, such as the sorcerer from the French cave art. And this is the male that is placed within a symbolic representation, as here was you can see with the phallic aspect that he's got going down on there. And he's also fused into the body of a stag. And this tells us something quite interesting. One, this could be seen as a confirmation of that umbilical link between man and creature that I mentioned before. The life motifs are not divided as they are in other representations where you see depictions of bison or some gazelles or something, and then you see humanoid figures around them. But here they are fused together, possibly meaning that by consuming the life of the stag, the animating spirit that once occupied that animal has transferred into the life of the man. So it's a kind of animism. Or that the stag represents another meaning of importance and still has become conjoined with the life patterns of the man. Maybe these people saw something in the animal that associated to another area of significance in their life that people wanted to acquire, and therefore they represented that within themselves in these anthropic depictions. And we do this quite a lot today as well. If you look at some of the animal motifs that accompany national flags, such as the three lions on the British flag, or the Russian bear or the American eagle. These are all predatory animals, and it's hardly surprising that these predatory animals show up as symbols on the flags and in the various regalia of these nations, because again, it's the same primitive observation. The brain is observing characteristics in these animals and is like the strength of the bear or the power of the eagle, or the vision of the eagle or something, or the majesty of the lion. And so you're not just going to have one lion, you're going to have 3 lions on the flag. So they're symbols of power, they're symbols of communication, and those communicative elements have been stolen out of the creatures and transferred into these regalias, these patterns that you see on the flags. Same fundamental mechanisms at play right now on these modern regalia that is happening all the way back then. It's exactly the same fundamental mechanism as far as I can see it. So, but either way, these kinds of therianthropic imagery, like the sorcerer that we were just talking about, they highlight a matter of prime import, that the patterns of life between human and beast are interdependent and woven together. Life in one way or another becomes an expression of another form of life. And now we get to another variation of these motifs that's really interesting. As we said, in the earliest human communities, the symbolic patterns showed us the animals of consumption and the primacy of the masculine form over the patterns of hunting and the religious expression. Now, as human adaptivity and ingenuity in exploiting its environment increases, we start to see a diversification in the ability to procure consumptive resources from nature, and likewise the symbolic expression that encodes them changes. Men are still very much in the primary when it comes to hunting, of course, but eventually we see an exploitation of the vegetable matter as well as an additional resource for consumption, and this brings 2 things with it. 1, vegetation and plant representation become more heavily expressed in the symbolic language, and 2, this activity belongs to the primary attention of the women, who tend to the gardens whilst the men go off to hunt. So the primitive association between the female and the earth now becomes united. And this is a very common association that's still held in our minds today. Remember, Mother Earth, Father Sky. The demarcation between the terrestrial and the cosmic is given a gendered significance, and as the means for consumption continue to diversify, so does the gendered expression when it comes to those things as well. Females are the gatekeepers of life, and men are the keys to that gate, just as the rain falls from the sky and impregnates the fertile earth below it. Man and woman, sky and earth, animal and vegetable are all tied into the systems of life and naturally find their own symbolic expression within the brain's program. So let me close now by giving you this really nice example of what happens when these symbolic systems and patterns of consumption converge. In the regions of southern Russia and Siberia, we find a wonderful combination of motifs contrasting the therianthropic synthesis that I described to you with our man, stag, sorcerer guy in the cave art. In these regions, the great mammoth remained as a creature of consumption, and we have several discoveries where ritualized remains have been found remaining human figures and parts of inscribed mammoth ivory. we also notice another inclusion into this mix, into the shape of those female Venus figures that we described in the first Symbol of Life video. The ivory, though, before we go and talk about the Venus, let me just tell you about the ivory. The ivory has been delicately arranged and features inscriptions of geometric patterning, zigzags, lattices, spirals, and the like. The same kinds of geometric markings that we see sometimes depicted on the European cave walls as well. Some hold to the idea, and I hold to this as well, that these probably represent codifications of what we would call entoptic phenomena, which are geometric patterns displayed on the back of the retina during intensified altered states of consciousness. Now, if these are entoptic phenomena, then it's not unreasonable to imagine that these were still a part of the ritual and religious life of these people. But the central figure here is not the phallic man sorcerer, but the feminine Venus, who is planted in these sites in the ground like a plant, like a literal plant, guarding the hearth. I was reading a book by Joseph Campbell called Primitive Mythology that I've got here, and he was saying that these Siberian Venus figures are associated with motif patterns that continue to reverberate in later symbolic cycles in history, such as the motif of the mythological meander, something that's called the meander in mythology, or it's more commonly known as the labyrinth in common language. And also we have another motif of the bird, like the doves of Aphrodite, for example. One of these sites was actually found, speaking of birds, containing 6 beautiful little birds carved out of mammoth ivory with the swastika inscribed beneath them, which makes them possibly the earliest depictions of the swastika in the world. And just on a little tangential thing here, I find it very disappointing how the swastika has become such a notorious symbolic item due to recent historical events, because it is a symbolic pattern that shows up all over the world. You know, the National Socialists didn't invent it by any means. They appropriated it and brought it into the folds of their political program. But nonetheless, if we're speaking about the exact symbolic intent of this symbol, if indeed there was any, I mean, that's open to speculation. They can't be simply accounted for as entoptic phenomena, because swastikas don't show up in the accounts of people who enter into these altered states of consciousness. So they must either be visually novel to the people who made them, or convey another or convey some kind of simplification or a reduction of another form, such as maybe overlapping snakes, or embodying the meander or the labyrinth like we talked about before, different directions, or the stylized V-shaped wings of a bird perhaps. It could represent any of these things. We don't know because it stretches so far back. But what's amazing about these sites is that you see the animal, the geometric, and the female coming together like this in complement. All we have to go on really is that these objects and their accompanying visual signifiers compose a ritual and symbolic significance that was very important to these primitive people. The interesting part is wondering what those symbolic things might mean and finding signs of correlation across other findings. Now let's talk about this. The word shaman actually comes from these regions. It comes from Siberia, and its precise meaning is debatable, but it usually refers to something like someone who knows, or someone who sees, someone who possesses specialized insight, which would be the way that I would go about describing it, specialized insight. And the reason why I bring up the Siberian shaman is because their initiation rites might lend us some of that necessary specialized insight into a possible correlation between the feminine and the animal that we can see here and in these archaeological findings. Now, in the initiation rites, the shaman has to spend extended time in the cold wastes in solitary isolation away from his tribe, where he enters into an altered state of consciousness. And in this altered state of consciousness, he comes across a female figure that is usually associated with an animal mother who gives him the strength to pass through the difficulties of the trial. Now, when I hear about accounts like this, and there are so many of them, especially when they come up with male shaman or male sorcerers or male practitioners or men who've consumed psychotropic substances and gone into these very deep altered states, I'm always reminded by the anima archetype in Jungian psychoanalysis. But I think that the association between the female, the primal animal, and the animating consumptive force in life that succeeds in continuing the patterns of life here, I find that so telling. We're starting to build up a picture of how the brain reconciles its relationship to the world in these videos, how it reconciles its relationship to the world through symbolic expression, and the various ways which these symbolic expressions can associate through time, long after, indeed, the brains that first created them have passed away. We've also seen in this video how gendered expressions show up in the symbology and how these things can change in conformity with the life development. So yeah, that brings to close another video in the Symbols of Life series. This is the second one now, so only one more to go. The next video, of course, will alternate to Symbols of Death. And so yeah, thanks very much for listening again. I hope that you've enjoyed this, and as usual, I'll see you again in the next one.